This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Let's talk about how not to talk about certain issues. We're going to go over to the UK, but this happens in America too. I suspect it happens in other countries. The way you say things, ask anybody, ask your children, ask your significant other. How you say things matters almost as much as what you're saying. And in the cultural and political realm, it usually matters more because people want to hear things a certain way. They don't want to be talked to certain other ways. This is from Sky News. A government minister has suggested that people struggling with the cost of living could take on more hours or move to a better paid job. Rachel McLean, the safeguarding minister, just stew on that for a second, told Sky News' Kay Burley that those were some of the ways households could, quote, protect themselves as prices soar. Now, the UK is having the same inflation problems we are, and we're going to give you an example of how not to talk about it if you're a sitting office holder, politician, commentator, or just want to be a decent human being. Ms. McLean said that every minister was looking at the issue as consumers face short-term pressures such as high energy and food bills, and added there was more help coming. So far, so good. And then it all went so terribly, terribly wrong. She added, quote, over the long term, we need to have a plan to grow the economy and make sure that people are able to protect themselves better, whether that's by taking on more hours or moving to a better paid job. And these are long-term actions, but that's what we're focused on as a government. Oh boy. No, folks can't just move to a better paying job. No, they can't just take on more hours. How out of touch and tone deaf can you get, whether you're in the UK, the US, or the United States of Hippopotamus? That's never going to go off right. It's never going to come across right. It's going to sound condescending, out of touch, because it's condescending and out of touch. If people could just snap their fingers, mount their magical unicorn, and ride over to the better paying jobs, they would. But that's not how this economy is currently working. Yes, there's a labor shortage and people are having some options, which means they're leaving poor job environments or lesser paying jobs because they can get other ones because of the competitive environment. But even at that, that's not how you say that. You don't tell the plebes to just go get better paying jobs. And you sure as hell don't take people who are already working hard, who are already at their limit, who just went through 2 years of COVID, who are in an uncertain environment, who are in an election year where they're getting bombarded on all sides about what they should think, feel, and want to do when they get to the ballot box, to just go work more hours. The people that work more hours and work on an hourly wage already know exactly how many hours they work. They know how many hours they need to work, and they know how many hours they want to work. And many of them can't get the hours that they want, or they have too many and it fries them out and they're not able to work effectively. This is just tone deaf idiocy from somebody who ought to know better. And whether it's in the UK or the US, we can point to other examples of this. This is very close to let them eat cake. We hear over and over again, well, they just need to work harder. Well, they just need to find a job. Well, they just need to put in more hours. Well, maybe they could find a better job. You can't snap your fingers and do things like that. You have to meet people where they are. Are they in an environment or in a place? In a piece I have coming out shortly where I did some research into the economics of that area, the average drive time for people who were working was over 31 minutes. That factors into things. Is it worth them to drive 31 minutes for a minimum wage job? How much of a job do they have to get to make that drive not only feasible financially, but worth their while? there's a lot of factors that go into things like the job shortage, like the financial crisis we're about to go through. Inflation is a tax on everybody, but it's especially a tax on the poorest among us because their dollar stretches the least. And now it's got to go even further. And then you start putting certain supply chain issues on top of it, and you have a recipe for disaster. And for a poll or a commentator, or frankly, anybody else to open up their line of inquiry and their analysis of the situation with just go get a better paying job or just work more hours is always going to make them look stupid, out of touch, and heartless. And it kind of is. You can't stop for a minute and understand that people who are working in an environment where we're constantly talking about labor shortages and the eponymous nobody wants to work, the ones that are already working are getting pushed to their limit because of those labor shortages. Good employees keep getting it handed to them and handed to them and handed to them because they're the only ones there. And eventually they reach their breaking point too. Don't tell those people to work more hours. And there's only so much upward mobility certain classes of workers have. Yes, you can try to get them more education. You can try to get them more training. You can do some things policy wise to open up an environment where they might have more options, but not all of them do. I am so sick and tired of unicorn rhetoric like this, the condescending rhetoric. It goes past parties and it goes past ideologies. Don't tell people to just go fix their lives, which is eventually what you're saying, like it's all their fault. It's not all their fault. These things are nuanced. The job market is complicated. The economy is complicated, and it's getting more complicated and less friendly to the workers. So before you open your pie hole, politicians, commentators, writers, talking heads on TV, remember a couple things. If you're talking and or writing words for a living, you are among the very most privileged people in our society. And before you start telling other people to just work harder, remember how good you have it and how privileged you have it. And that them working harder or them trying to get better is going to take a whole lot more than just your wishful thinking. Be mindful, be empathetic, be sympathetic, and above all, try to be a better human being. Because telling people to just do better when they can't is one of the cruelest things you can possibly do. More Heard Tell right after this.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. He is back. Dennis Sanders, our good friend up in the Twin City area. He is a writer. He's a commentator. He's also a local pastor, man that wears many, many, many hats and does them all very well. He also has his own platform that we're going to talk about in a minute to do some writing. And he also joins us at ordinary-times.com. Dennis, how are you, my friend?
I am doing well, doing very well.
Always thrilled to talk to you, especially on this, because we've been kind of kicking around wanting to talk about this for a while. But we were covering labor a while back. You did a little bit of pushback of how we covered labor, but let's get the bona fides first because you're from one of the great labor areas of the world, Flint, Michigan.
Yes, I was born and raised in Flint. Both my parents were auto workers, so that meant that they were both members of the United Auto Workers, different locals, but both members, union members.
So you've got that strong union background. You grew up in that area. But you've also seen the after effects where, you know, those great union jobs, those great union benefits didn't really play out for everybody too awful well, did it, in the long run?
No. And that's kind of the hard thing is growing up as I did in the 70s and 80s, Flint had that was the thing that was going on in the city. In the Flint area alone, there were about 80,000 people that worked for General Motors. And for those who don't know, General Motors actually had its start in Flint. Today, it is probably around 8,000. So that's, as you can tell, it's a huge amount of jobs that were lost that really, really changed the city in ways that are, I think, for a lot of people, unimaginable.
Yeah, and this is a story. You're talking about Flint. You can talk about Youngstown, Ohio, where I
Exactly.
have family that just decimated Black Monday, one of the real labor stories in the history of the U.S. Pittsburgh, anywhere in the Rust Belt. What you tell me, because you grew up with that, it's part of your DNA, that blue collar union labor, something that was a lot of pride in that. People said, I'm a union guy, and they meant it, and it meant something. But try to explain that to somebody of a later generation that just thinks of Detroit as, the Detroit area and the Flint area and the economic recessions that happened as that faded away. Try to take people back to that time, growing up in that time when that was your whole identity almost, wasn't it?
It pretty much was. And it was a kind of an age of people. It was sort of in some ways a family. Lots of things that GM sponsored that were made up part of the community. And I think people had pride. This was something that you could go into without going to college and make actually a fairly good salary that you could support a family on. And so I think the cost of the kind of the how people lived and everything was pretty good. Obviously, we weren't making as much as doctors or things to that extent, but I think for people working in manufacturing, it was fairly good pay. It allowed people to do things they probably wouldn't have been able to do. And I think especially for African Americans who, kind of like my dad, came up from the South to places like Michigan for more opportunity, it did get them that. It got them greater opportunity, greater economic benefits that they would have never had they just stayed in the South.
Yeah, talking to our friend Dennis Sanders. Okay, so the next step of that journey, though, of course, is the unions diminish. We know union labor specifically in the United States of America is at its lowest form of basically recorded since we started tracking it. We know the industrials have gone down. You just mentioned it. Do we overblow how benevolent companies used to be? Was it union power that balanced it out? There seems to be a lot of myth making and legends involved in these sorts of things. Try to cut through some of that for us. What was it that changed so bad? It can't all be one and all the other. How do you kind of foresee it looking back on it now, and especially with the way you've been writing about it?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think there were companies and people who believed that if you wanted to have people buying your products, you had to pay them well. They believed in trying to help their local communities. I think one of the things that I did recently, a podcast on someone by the name of J. Irwin Miller. He was the CEO of Cummins Engine in Indiana. And there was actually an interesting article in the Atlantic kind of about all the things that he did to help benefit that local community, from helping, bringing kind of world-renowned architects to build public buildings to all of that. But it was also unions as well, that it's kind of that unions were pushing for better wages, for safer working conditions, just things to that extent that they were pushing for, and that sometimes meant going on strike to do that. One of the things that was really a part of Flint lore and part of labor lore is the 1936-37 sit-down strike in Flint, where several of the factories, they basically literally stopped and sat down. And this was simply for that, at that time, to getting labor recognition. The company, General Motors, didn't want to recognize the union. And this was a way for them to kind of make that possible. And I think once that happened, again, it brought forth things like better benefits, healthcare, retirement, things that in a lot of cases we take for granted, was done really because of labor. But it's not all labor, and it's not all benevolent companies. It's both. And I think in some ways we've lost both of those things in our modern culture.
See, I know that, coming from West Virginia, if there was ever a group of people that ever needed a union, it was coal miners.
Mhm.
Because, they owned you. They owned you with the script. You lived in a company house. They paid you with company script. It was terrible what was going on with the coal miners. You could do it with any other industry as well. But at the same time, the unions kind of warped and developed. They were not always the benevolent organizations they should have been either, were they?
No, I think that's also important to know too. Unions sometimes also had a racist history. They wouldn't necessarily include African Americans in their unions. That changed over time, but that wasn't always the case. And I think even in modern day, they've been slow to adapt to kind of the changing nature of the market. As we've become a more globalized society, we have to find ways of how do we continue to support things like trade, not necessarily to the extent that it's hurting people, but I think that there are benefits to trade. And so how do you do that and also support workers? And I think sometimes unions were slow in getting to that. They were also sometimes slow in dealing with competition, especially with United Auto Workers in the 70s, as we started to see the rise of Japan, especially in the car market. I think both General Motors and the unions were not quick in trying to figure out how to compete against these companies that were now kind of making their way into the American marketplace. So, there are always drawbacks to unions. And I think I always want to say that, unions aren't perfect. And some of those problems do need to be lifted up. But I also think even as imperfect as they are, they do have a purpose in our society.
Yeah. And one of the things, because people knock me and think I'm anti union, I'm actually not anti union. I don't think unions are a one size fits all solution. I don't think they're this panacea where everything a union does is perfect, because we know better with the record of that. This is one of the few things I think Europe actually does a better job than we do. Unions
Mhm.
are not as adversarial. They're not as political. They work more in partnership. They're more symbiotic. How did it become so adversarial between unions and the companies? And again, it can't all be just one or the other, despite the way we're told it is, that it's just these evil, wicked companies. Look, companies got to make money too.
Mhm.
How did this become so adversarial and to the detriment of the unions? Because we see the union membership, it's the lowest it's ever been.
That's a good question. I don't have a great answer to that, except that I think sometimes just in American society, we tend to be more adversarial in our nature, as opposed to kind of in Europe. I think sometimes some of the different ways that our different societies came out of that. My guess is, especially in Europe, in the United States, we have not really had a history of strong socialist parties for one thing, whereas there has been a strong case of that. So part of adversarial relationship probably was shown more in the voting booth than it was in actually the workplace. As it is here, it's not as much shown in the voting booth, so it showed itself in the workplace. So I think that's kind of where the difference is. At least it kind of a guess from what I can observe. But I think that that's something that probably needs to change. I think that the adversarial approach that might have worked in the 1930s and 40s, when this was a new thing and companies weren't as amenable. But I think that we're in a different age now. And so I think that unions have to change with that and maybe look at what Europe is doing, or to think about, I know that I believe it's Oren Cass, who works with American Compass, which is a conservative think tank that tends to be more pro-labor, but thinks that we should have something that maybe is, instead of working with one company, that it's the union is more based on different industries. That makes it a little bit less confrontational, but more kind of working together. So I think that there is definitely room and a necessity for unions to change with the times. Just because they exist doesn't mean that the way that they are structured now is the way that they should always be structured.
Yeah, the old they call it the working guild or the trade guild model.
Exactly.
We're talking to our friend Dennis Sanders. We're going to continue with him after the break. We're going to continue to talk about labor, union and otherwise, and also he's got a great example of how labor and things change with Kmart and Sears a lot, and the downfall of it, except in one place where it's still thriving. We'll talk about that when we come back. Our friend Dennis Saunders on Her Tell right after this. Welcome back to Her Tell. We're having a good time talking to our buddy Dennis Sanders, but kind of a serious topic on labor and unions and things of this nature. One thing about unions that always strikes me, I think they're really misbegotten in where they're picking their battles right now. Organized labor, especially big labor, they are all in on going against the gig economy, the secondary economy, whatever you want to call it. Why do you want to alienate? Look, unions are down to something like 10% of the workforce. The gig economy is up to something like 30% of the workforce. Why are you picking a fight with the very people that you're arguing that you want to come into your unions? And all you're really doing is alienate them because they're like, look, leave us alone and let us work. This seems really misbegotten to me.
That I totally agree with. I think one of the worst things that I've seen, especially the law that came out in California, which I think wreaked havoc on a lot of gig workers. You know, I think part of it comes from this belief that they think that the gig economy is just exploitative. And so they think that, well, wouldn't you really want to just work in an office or in an industry or whatever, like everyone else? What I think the unions don't realize is that the nature of work has changed. There are a lot of people that want to work on their own. They want to be contractors. They want the flexibility that comes with all of that. And so coming in with a law that basically messes all of this up isn't helpful, and it really just makes more enemies against unions than what is necessary. I mean, if unions want to be of help in this changed economy, then what they should be about is trying to create guilds or things to that extent that would help people who do go into the gig economy instead of trying to basically mess up what they want to do, which is to work independently and to call their own hours.
Yeah, here's where I depart from some of our labor-friendly brethren. I think you absolutely have a right to start a union. I've been a supervisor in a company that was non-union. We had it hanging on the walls. I've facilitated the meetings for union reps to come into the non-union rep. We set them up in a break room. There's very specific rules how you have to handle those things. I've done all that. I've interacted with them. I know how those things work. My thing is, you absolutely have a right to have a union, but that also means you should absolutely have a right to not have to go through a union to make your livelihood. And that just seems to be the disconnect with some of the big labor folks and people that I know that are genuinely pro-worker, and they really believe that that's the best thing to do. If you're just changing one tyranny of a company to the tyranny of a union, and especially if you have a union that also has the backing of the federal government, which all too often is the case nowadays, there's no way you can convince me that that's pro-worker, because if the union has the backing of the government and you don't have a choice to be in the union or not, where's a worker go then?
Yeah, and I agree. One of the things I remember growing up that I can just remember, even as a kid, I didn't like this, is the whole concept of I think they would call it a closed shop, where basically if you took a job, you are automatically part of the union. And there was a part of me that was bothered by that, because you didn't have a choice of whether you wanted to be in the union or not. And I get what they're trying to get at with collective bargaining and all of that, but you've taken that person's choice of what they want to do out of their hands and just made them and just forced them to do something that they don't want to do. And I think, that's kind of related to what's going on with the gig workers, is this belief that unions are good, so everyone can benefit. And realizing that there is also choice in this. People don't have to join a union. Unions are voluntary organizations. And even in spite of all the good I think that they do, and they do a lot, but it's good, they're voluntary, and people shouldn't be forced to be part of one if they don't want to be part of one. And I think that's okay. That's part of, to me, that's part of what it is to be an American. It's a sense of choice of what we want to do.
It's part of what's killing the unions too, that the union was always supposed to be the voice of the worker. Well, everybody's got a voice now because they all have social media accounts. Like they can Google what their company's doing. They don't need their union rep to explain stock options to them. They all has technology just kind of made part of what the traditional union was obsolete.
They've made part of it. I don't think they've made all of it. And I think this is maybe where the initial pushback came when I wrote to you a while back, is the belief that because we have a more atomized society, social media, things that allow us to speak up, we tend to think that we have more power than we used to. And I think that there in some cases that's true, but in other cases it's not. You may not have the power to say, I would like to have better benefits or to deal with better healthcare. So there are some areas in some industries, not every industry, your one voice doesn't always carry when you're up against a management. And so that's where you would see a need for a union to kind of be that voice. Where I think the caveat is you have to want to have them be your voice. They can't just come in and be your voice. That I think is wrong because that turns people off. People don't want to have something being done for them. And in some cases, they don't want necessarily a one size fits all thing. So unions are still necessary, but in this day and age, in the age of social media, in the age of a gig worker, it's not going to operate like it did in 1968. We're not that economy. And that's, I think, part of the problem of why unions aren't doing as well is because they haven't necessarily always changed with the times.
Welcome back to Hertel. Let's talk a little economics for a second. And this is CNBC has some data here. Is we talked about underlying effects in the economy that doesn't show up. One of them was the service workers. When schools are closed, they don't have childcare. So people that pick up shifts and things like that, they don't have the ability to work. That messes with the data. It messes with the economy. Here's another stat that's showing up now that we're post-COVID, but still happening. 42%, this is according to CNBC, we'll link to it in the show notes, of service workers have no input into their schedules. You think, well, nobody has an input in their schedules. We're not talking about whether they work or not. We're talking about when they work. Listen to these statistics. There were more than 50 million people working in retail services in May, according to the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. When it comes to precarious schedules, though, workers in these fields experience an array of offenses. In the fall of 2021, for example, workers reported the following. This is a survey. 64% of workers received less than 2 weeks' notice of their forthcoming work schedule. 57% experienced shift time changes, including having 1 day or less notice of these changes. 36% were scheduled a closing shift with an opening shift the following day. And 42% of workers had no input at all into the timing of their work schedules. Now, you might be rolling your eyes a little bit and going, well, what does that matter? Well, it matters a lot when you're talking about 15 million people who can't schedule more than a day or two ahead of time. And you start thinking about things like childcare. You start thinking about things like school. You start thinking about their own contributions to the economy when they might do their own shopping or their own travel or their own whatever else. These are economic factors that we don't think of because they're more on the cultural side of like, oh, well, I don't know how often I'm working. But when you start looking at the labor shortage issues, the fact that the labor market is booming, but there's not enough workers, this is one of those non-specific factors that is worth talking about. People get tired of getting jerked around. And when they have an option to go to a different job, it's stuff like this on top of pay, on top of benefits that really affect whether or not they stay in a job. So the high stress, high mobility jobs where the schedules are bad, and especially with non-great employers who are addicted to last minute scheduling, this kind of stuff is why you're having trouble hiring people. It's one of those stats that doesn't show up, but it's starting to make a difference and something worth considering. More Heard Tell after this. Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. Let's speak to that one-size-fits-all approach for a second, because to be fair, there are lots of companies that abuse the independent contractor labor to not pay benefits, to not do wages. That does get abused by companies. The thing here, though, is I don't know that a one-size-fits-all, well, we can just unionize the entire gig economy is going to work, because the gig economy organically grew because it went into, lack of a better term, gaps of employment, people that wanted more freedom, people that wanted more independent thing. Companies rose through those things. Putting this old solution across the board onto a new and burgeoning sector of the economy that's growing by leaps and bounds. And not everybody in the gig economy is miserable. A lot of people like that flexibility. You and me are in the gig economy. We're both freelance writers and media people. I think this may be just one of those things where we're trying to do an old solution to a new problem, and you're just going to end up making a bigger mess. Am I wrong there?
No, you're absolutely correct. They're still using guidelines, to me, that seem largely reminiscent of the 1930s. Labor law of the 1930s and the scenarios that we have right now, very different. It's not the 1930s anymore. It's 2022. We have a lot of different metrics at play. We have worker kind of makeup that is very different. We don't thankfully see as much misclassification as possible. Certainly some companies may engage in it, and if they are abusing those powers, they can have those situations rectified and be targeted, or not targeted, but essentially reformed if they have been engaging in those abuses. But they want to take it a step further. And we saw this play out in California, where they said this is to essentially address in California's Assembly Bill 5 to rectify a huge, huge problem. It's only going to affect a small slither of the gig economy, the rideshare workers in their eyes, but it in fact extended well beyond rideshare workers who they claimed were missing out on benefits for healthcare and dental and other things, that they were wholly misclassified under the eyes of California labor law. But it, of course, like every law with unintended consequences or intended consequences, I think in this case, they saw successful, highly skilled independent workers who don't really hinge their work output on the need for benefits or the need to unionize. They saw their workload shrink demonstrably. I know on the offhand that a lot of people had to either give up gig work or freelance work altogether. They had to move to a different state. They had contracts canceled on them because people from out of state were very scared about what California's law would entail and said, well, we have to unfortunately cancel your contract because of the new labor law that California has into place. So a lot of people in California saw a huge loss of work. I think it's probably upwards of at least 1 million people. There's no key figures yet, but I know at least that figure, a lot of people in either a permanent fashion or at least a partial fashion have seen their freelancer livelihood eroded in some capacity. And I wish they did have those numbers more, but I was told by people that at least 1 million people have seen some sort of setback in terms of their employment status and kind of their success as freelancers. And we see these kind of copycat efforts in other blue states. In Virginia, and actually in your state of West Virginia, I know the governor signed into law last year, probably one of the strongest independent contractor worker laws in place to ensure that the IRS standard and the common law standard would be adhered to, and that companies, especially labor unions, companies that work with labor unions or labor unions themselves, would not abuse claims of misclassification to displace independent workers from the workforce. And Virginia is starting to see that language too. Like you had mentioned, I was in the process of testifying and they at last minute carried the bill over to next year. It's a good thing. So the Democrat controlled Senate wouldn't kill the bill, which is ripe for potential. And they wanted, the governor's office, I was told, wanted to rewrite it or lend some commentary a bit more to make it stronger. So there is an interest from this new administration in Virginia to pass it. But you see, obviously, California and a lot of states responding to California in the opposite direction to protect independent workers, because I think red state governors largely recognize that this is a burgeoning workforce. There's largely no misclassification or very limited instances when it's an independent worker who voluntarily engages in a contract with companies. Probably like you, I voluntarily enter agreements with companies. It's mutually agreed to terms. I get to decide and agree to the payment. If I want benefits, I can set aside money myself. That's not really something I hinge my work output on, because that's very minor. If I wanted to do that, I would have stayed in a 9-to-5 job. But essentially, I think people, especially big labor, misunderstands why people go into this. And I think they're kind of ignoring where the trends are going economically speaking, especially in the wake of the pandemic. We see a lot of people leaving 9-to-5 jobs in what has been billed as the Great Resignation or now the Great Reshuffle. And people have cited flexibility, more free arrangements, more freedom to choose who to work with, your work hours, things of that sort, and having more happiness and better well-being, mental well-being, things of that sort, more time with family. A lot of people have cited those factors as reasons for them leaving traditional workplaces for these more flexible work arrangements, or maybe even traditional jobs now allowing for remote and more flexible options. I've seen that some companies are doing that as well, recognizing that they risk losing workers to flexible work arrangements if they don't adopt these more flexible type of scenarios to their workers. So I would say the regulators are going against the trends. They're failing to see that the regulatory framework of the 1930s does not apply to the regulatory framework of today. And I think you see a lot of workers telling regulators, do not regulate us out of existence. Do not reclassify us, because if you do, it'll have a lot of very bad consequences for people, for the GDP, for people's well-being, and for just kind of this new and kind of last, I would say, iteration of entrepreneurship that you see, pure unadulterated entrepreneurship that can take someone from being self-employed to running a small brick and mortar shop to maybe one day running a big business.
Talking to Gabriella Hoffman. When we come back, we're going to dig into that labor just a little bit. There's an appointee that's very important trying to get into the labor department that we're going to discuss. Also talk about something not labor related. She's got a little bit of conservation work she's been doing. Talk about that to finish up. We'll be back with Gabriella Hoffman of Young Voices right after this on Hard Tell. Welcome back to Heard Tell. We're continuing our conversation with Gabrielle Hoffman. All right, here's something that we get into with social media a lot. People want to equate, especially people that don't want to argue in good faith, that, well, if you're against unions, you're against labor and you're against workers. I'm not against union. You'd mentioned it. I'm from West Virginia. Look, if anybody ever needed a union, it was the coal miners. And talk about the 30s, even before that, Blair Mountain back in the teens and 20s. It's not that I'm against the unions. I'm against the current iteration of big labor unions in America as they exist now, where they have the kind of antiquated model like you talked about, and it becomes a power structure. And now that you have a power structure like that, that is combining with the force of the federal government to give them what they want, my fear is these labor unions, and I think we have some data to back this up, when you talk about something like the gig economy, you're going to be trading one poor taskmaster for a new taskmaster that's even got less ability to fight against it.
Yeah, with the discussion about enhancing big labor, so you've probably heard about the Protecting the Right to Organize Act, which is kind of the federal companion to California's AB 5. And this would be a complete restructuring of employment law, labor law as we know it. And I think a lot of us argue that it would take us back to the 1930s. And again, it doesn't match kind of the standards of where labor law and where labor trends are going. And the PRO Act, in addition to kind of reclassifying, or in their words, addressing misclassification concerns of workers, they would essentially repeal right to work. So states wouldn't be able to operate. I think there are 27 states right now in the country, West Virginia and Virginia being one of them, that allow their workers to not have to join a union as a prerequisite for employment. So they would essentially make it so you repeal right to work and to have your employment hinge on union membership. Additionally, You would give greater oversight to labor unions under the PRO Act if it were to pass. That would essentially make it so union bosses would essentially dictate the affairs of employer-employee relations. So an employer will essentially have to give worker information to these union bosses who are now intermediaries in businesses if this hypothetical situation were to play out. And we don't know exactly what information they would obtain. Would they obtain a worker's social security number, their birth date, home address, bank account statements? Essentially, how much power are we giving them and how much private information are they going to be able to have at their disposal? So a lot of critics of the PRO Act have said there's a lot of privacy concerns, especially giving labor unions more emboldened power to carry out these actions. So there's privacy concerns, there's obviously free association concerns, and essentially the unions would gain or seek to gain or potentially even become like $3 billion richer. And they're a pretty influential, financially wealthy welfare organization. That's how they're classified, I guess, in the nonprofit space. And they would essentially become more wealthier, all the while disempowering a workforce that's about 3 times as larger as them. So this would give unions unchecked power. You wouldn't be able to contest a case against them. You wouldn't be able to withdraw yourself from a union. They would make it extremely hard for you to not have your work be conditional on union membership. So everything would be at the behest of unions, and you wouldn't be able to prove otherwise, or you wouldn't be able to identify otherwise. Even if you're self-employed, they want everyone, I hate to say it, to return back to a traditional job, a 9-to-5 job, even though people are willingly and voluntarily leaving 9-to-5 jobs. You can't force people back into those arrangements. And we saw the pandemic actually give license to the fact that you can go away from a traditional job and you don't need a union. And you probably have seen the headlines where even though there was often discussions about different companies allowing their workers to organize or different worker organization efforts to collectively bargain in Starbucks and other different conglomerates, we saw a shrinking of the union workforce in this country over a year. It went from 10.8% of the workforce to 10.3%, despite the big media push, despite big labor supposedly being more emboldened, despite a lot of the puff pieces and the positive stories about this is people have a positive view of unions, but for some reason the union workforce is shrinking. And there's a disconnect between the argument, because how could such glowing, raving reviews of these entities, which if you look at the polling, they're actually more mixed. And if you look at kind of more bipartisan polling, not polls conducted by labor unions, it's actually more mixed or kind of in the negative for labor unions. People don't want to change what currently already exists, including Democrats who may be supportive of big labor aims. And you see a lot of independents and, of course, Republicans say that unions shouldn't be given more power. And this is evidenced through a Forbes Tate poll that was released last June about the PRO Act. And you actually saw pretty bipartisan widespread support about opposing different tenets, the right to work revoking component, the ABC test implementation, and giving unions more access to private information. And so that carries over to the nominee who we were kind of alluding to earlier, David Weil, who wants to return back to his wage and hour division administrator role. And he would like to implement aspects of the PRO Act, especially this ABC test when it comes to worker classification efforts. He also has a bone to pick with the freelance economy in the greater scheme of things. He calls this the fissured workplace. He sees it in a very negative light. So he's not a friend, and I don't think he'd be a fair arbiter of labor law with respect to this. I think he would create law and regulation that would make it harder for people to independently work, and also for franchises and franchisees to operate as well. He has had a bone to pick with franchisees as well. And he also had kind of the gumption to extend the overtime pay rule under the Obama administration, and the courts put him in check. So he wants to kind of play around with those 3 things as well. So a lot of people in the independent workforce, whether they're independent contractors or they're franchisees or franchise business owners, they'll have to be very concerned about his potential return to the Department of Labor again, if he were to be confirmed. But right now, I haven't seen any indication that his confirmation will move through to a full Senate vote yet. I think Senator Joe Manchin has expressed concerns with him privately. And I'm not sure about the 2 Arizona senators and Mark Warner, but there has been some opposition to him on a bipartisan basis as well. But those are kind of the 2 things that people should be aware about.
Yeah, but when it comes to him, we're talking to Gabrielle Hoffman. about labor issues. When it comes to him, even if he's not confirmed, this goes to what you're talking about how power works when we're dealing with labor and how the government and big unions and the workforce and workers themselves all meet, because most people probably have never heard of the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor, but it's these kind of bureaucratic administrative postings. They're appointed positions, so they have to go through review. Theoretically, that's through our representatives, but let's not get into all that right at the moment. That's a position that has immense power when you start talking about things like the gig economy, doesn't it? So just explain for a second, though. This is really important. That it sounds kind of like, oh well, this is just a government posting. No, this really really matters if you're trying to be an Uber driver, or if you're trying to work for Amazon as a third party carrier, or pick whatever you want, freelance writing, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, if he were to return back to the agency, especially with his animus towards it, I think that presents a huge conflict of interest. You're supposed to be a neutral arbiter. If you're presiding over lawmaking or rulemaking in this capacity, you should have someone who's more fair to it, who hasn't written against the gig economy or called for its quashing. In a sense, like I said, I think a lot of these regulators in the Biden administration and those in the agency side just are denying reality. Like I said, they have a huge disconnect between the workforce and kind of special interests, or kind of the concerns that they're hearing. They still kind of view labor law in the lens of the 1930s. They think that there's bad workplaces, things are dirty, workers are dying, and that there has to be a huge remedy, a big sweeping remedy to these problems. But they're taking maybe some case studies, and certainly there are some concerns. I know people have heard about Amazon. I've seen about some of the worker conditions there. I can't really weigh in on it because I don't know exactly if it's true or not, but I know a lot of people, even some on the right, have said, well, Amazon kind of exploits their workers and does this. And then you hear other people who say, well, maybe this is a mischaracterization. But a lot of people have jumped onto kind of these bigger companies that have tapped into independent contractors because they want them to unionize. Although when workers at Amazon were presented the opportunity to unionize, especially in the Alabama plant, if I'm not misinterpreting that case, they actually overwhelmingly rejected efforts to unionize by like 70 something percent to 20, 30 some odd percent. So when workers are presented the opportunity to collectively bargain, they don't want to. And I think you even see some deunionization efforts too. There was a chicken poultry plant in Delaware that recently brought to a vote whether or not to continue to be unionized. And the workers ultimately decided to withdraw themselves from the union. So you don't hear those stories often. And certainly you can cherry pick as to what stories resonate. You could say, well, this company is engaging in this egregious labor abuse. But what about the opposite, where labor unions are effectively tampering with business affairs, and the workers who have the decision to unionize or not, they don't want to unionize, and they're not given the choice in some cases to reject unionization efforts if they're in a non-right to work state, or they decide to repeal unionization or collective bargaining agreements. So it could be framed in any way, obviously, but I think they're ignoring the fact that workers don't want to be, again, regulated in a one-size-fits-all approach. And I think people see, because of the pandemic, that maybe the traditional work framework, including union jobs, are maybe not suitable for people going forward. And I think what people fail to understand is, yes, while we may have I have personal gripes with labor unions, I think they have exceeded their power. They're not really representative of all workers. In right to work states, they can exist. We see here in Virginia with powerful teachers unions, even though we're a right to work state, they're able to exercise muscle and prevent certain policies from going into place. It doesn't mean they can't exist. It just means that you have to allow for people to not want to unionize if they don't want to. And we want to have coexistence. I don't think they want to have coexistence with us. And that's probably a sinister look into the issue, but we can have coexistence. I don't think they're open to having coexistence with us because they view us as competition.
All the music on Her Tell is provided under a Creative Content license from monstercat.com.
Growing businesses and finance professionals, you need Bill Spend and Expense, the free-to-use spend management software. It's powered by the Bill Divvy Corporate Card, which helps growing companies scale with credit lines of $500 to $15 million, automated expense reports, and as many virtual cards as you need. For a limited time, get $500 when you get started with Bill Spend and Expense. Request a demo at bill.com/get500. Terms and conditions apply. Advertised credit ranges are not guaranteed and are determined at approval. Card issued by Cross River Bank, member FDIC.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.